All right, let's kick off this deep dive and take a closer look at e-commerce microservices architecture. You guys have been asking about it, sending in some guides and articles, and honestly, the hype is pretty real when you look at the numbers. I mean, the market's expected to go from like $4.2 billion in 2024 to over $13 billion by 2033. That's a crazy amount of growth.
It's definitely a signal that things are changing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of buzz around how this architecture can, like, revolutionize online businesses,
Hmm.
make them more adaptable and scalable and all that.
Yeah, for sure. So, left into it, a lot of people hear e-commerce microservices architecture and they're like, okay, what is that?
Okay.
I've seen the Lego brick analogy used a lot, but I'm still not totally clear on what that actually means. Like, how does it actually
Right.
work in practice?
Right. The Lego thing is a good starting point, but maybe a little oversimplified. Basically, each brick, you can think of it as a separate service,
Mhm.
right? One handles payments, another's for managing products, another powers the search bar. And all these separate pieces,
Mm.
they work together to create the whole system, just like Legos, right?
Okay, so instead of this massive system where everything's interconnected, you have all these smaller units. But wouldn't that, I don't know, wouldn't that make things more complicated?
It seems counterintuitive, but when you think about it, say you want to update just one small part of your online store. In a traditional setup, even a tiny change can mean testing and redeploying the whole system.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, so with microservices, you only update that one service you're working on. Everything else is left untouched.
So that would save a ton of time, especially for those larger businesses. I can only imagine how much downtime those big updates can cause.
Exactly, and that's where this idea of single responsibility comes in. It's like one of the core principles of this whole thing. Each microservice, it focuses on doing one thing really well, and that makes it way easier to develop, to test, to maintain.
Right, makes sense.
And some companies have reported up to 30% faster debugging times just because of this.
Wow, 30%. That's significant. Now, the guide you sent over also mentioned this autonomy principle. What's that all about?
Autonomy is all about giving those microservices their independence.
Yeah.
Right. Like imagine each one is kind of self-governing. It has its own little world, its own data storage, its own way of managing things.
Okay, so they're not dependent on each other.
Exactly. And that means development teams can work on their own thing. They don't have to wait for other teams. They can use whatever tools work best for them. They can update their code whenever they need to without messing anything else up.
So it's like it streamlines the whole development process.
Exactly. And the guide actually says that something like 75% of businesses using this see 50% fewer dependencies between their teams.
That's huge.
And then there's fault isolation. What happens if one part of your platform crashes?
Oh.
In a traditional system, the whole thing could go down.
Right. Makes sense.
With microservices, only that one service that crashed is affected. Everything else keeps running smoothly.
Okay, so it's about minimizing downtime. The guide actually mentioned applications built with this have like 99.95% uptime, even with those individual failures happening.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive how resilient it can be.
So we've talked principles, but what about the nuts and bolts? The guide listed 14 key components of e-commerce microservices architecture. Should we take a look at those?
Let's do it. We got to start with what your customer actually sees and interacts with, right? The user interface.
Okay, so how's that usually handled in this kind of setup?
Most modern platforms are using these things called single-page applications, or SPAs.
SPAs, right. I've heard the term, but could you refresh my memory on what they are exactly?
Sure. So think about when you're browsing an online store.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, the whole page would reload every time you clicked something.
Oh, yeah.
SPAs, they load the page once and then just update the content as you go.
So it's much faster.
Way faster
Ah.
and smoother. Like the guide even says SPAs can be up to 67% faster than traditional websites.
That's a huge difference. No wonder everyone's moving towards that.
Right. And then there's the microservices themselves, the heart of the system. Each one is dedicated to a specific business function. Like you've got one for managing product info, one for processing payments, and so on.
So it's like a well-oiled machine with all these parts working together.
Exactly. And the cool part is, if you need to scale, you can just scale that one service.
Oh, that's smart.
Like imagine a flash sale. You can beef up your order processing and payment services without touching anything else.
So flexible. But with all these independent services, how do they talk to each other?
That's where the API gateway comes in. It's like the central hub handling all the communication. Think of it like a control tower at an airport.
Keeping everything organized.
Yeah, it handles authentication, it prevents abuse, it makes sure traffic is flowing smoothly.
Makes sense. Sounds like a pretty critical part.
It is. And then you have databases. In a microservices world, each service has its own dedicated database.
So not one giant database for everything?
Nope, each one is optimized for its specific service. Leads to way better performance.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the search service. Super important for e-commerce. This is what lets your customers find what they're looking for quickly.
And I imagine it needs to be pretty sophisticated, especially with these huge product catalogs and all the different filters people use.
Absolutely. And that's why a lot of platforms use Elasticsearch.
Elasticsearch.
Yeah, it's built to handle tons of data and complex searches.
So it can handle all those millions of products and filters without slowing down.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful for e-commerce.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got search covered. What about inventory?
Right. So inventory management is another key piece. It keeps track of everything that's in stock. Make sure you don't oversell anything.
So no more out-of-stock messages after someone's already placed an order?
Yeah, that's the idea. It's all integrated with order processing, shipping, all that. Keeps everything running smoothly.
Pretty complex stuff.
Definitely. But it's essential.
So once an order is placed, how does it get to the customer?
That's where shipping and logistics comes in. This service handles everything related to getting that product from point A to point B.
So more than just slapping a label on a box?
Oh yeah, it calculates shipping costs, chooses the best carrier, generates tracking numbers. It can even integrate with third-party logistics systems for real-time tracking updates.
That's impressive. So we've got the products moving, but how do businesses know if all this is actually working?
Right. That's where analytics and reporting comes in. This is all about collecting and analyzing data. Like, how are customers interacting with the store? What are they buying? Where are the bottlenecks?
So it's about turning all that raw data into something useful.
Exactly. It helps businesses understand what's working and what's not.
Makes sense. Now, the guide also mentions something called a cache layer. I'm not super familiar with caching.
Basically, it's like a temporary storage space for data that's accessed frequently.
So it speeds things up,
Yeah, instead of going all the way back to the main database every time, you just grab it from the cache.
like a shortcut.
Exactly. And finally, there's the CI/CD pipeline.
CI/CD, that sounds a little intimidating.
It stands for Continuous Integration and Continuous Deployment. Basically, it automates the whole process of developing, testing, and deploying new code changes.
So it takes a lot of the manual work out of the equation.
Right, and it means you can release updates and new features much faster.
And I'm guessing it reduces the chance of errors, too.
Exactly, because everything is automated and tested thoroughly at each step.
This has been a great overview of the components, but what does it all mean for businesses and for us as consumers?
That's the big question, right? And that's what we'll explore next. All right, so we've laid out the foundation. Let's talk about how this architecture actually benefits businesses.
Yeah, let's get to the good stuff. The guide mentions a whole bunch of advantages, but from your perspective, what are the biggest wins for e-commerce businesses?
I think one of the most impactful is scalability, something we touched on earlier. Like, traditional systems can really struggle to handle sudden spikes in traffic.
Right, like during a big sale or something.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah.
But with microservices, you could just scale up the specific areas that need it.
Oh, so you don't have to scale up the entire system.
Exactly. It's way more efficient.
Makes sense.
And this flexibility also leads to faster time to market. Businesses can roll out new features and products much quicker.
So they're not stuck with those long development cycles anymore.
Right. They can be way more agile.
And that's crucial in today's world, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just about speed. It's also about reducing risk. When you have smaller, independent services, maintenance becomes much less disruptive.
Yeah, I can see that.
You can update one microservice without taking the whole platform offline.
So less downtime for the business.
Exactly.
It's like, I don't know, it's like being able to change a tire without having to rebuild the entire car.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, the guide also had some interesting real-world examples. The Amazon case study really stood out to me. They were one of the first to adopt this approach, right?
Yeah, back in the early 2000s.
And they've had some pretty amazing results.
They've been able to scale massively, handle billions of requests per day.
And constantly add new features, like that Alexa voice shopping thing.
It's a perfect example of how powerful this can be. They've achieved incredible scalability, reliability, and agility.
The guide mentioned they have like 99.9% uptime with this architecture.
Pretty impressive, right?
Definitely.
And that comes down to the full isolation we talked about. Even if one service goes down, the rest of the platform keeps running.
So it's super resilient.
Now, the guide also talked about headless commerce.
That one was a little bit confusing to me at first.
Yeah, it's basically about separating the front end from the back end.
Okay, so the part that customers see and interact with is separate from all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Right. Think of it like this. You can have multiple heads or front ends, like a website, a mobile app, a voice assistant, all connected to the same body or back end.
Oh, I see.
So you have more flexibility to create different experiences, all powered by the same infrastructure.
That's pretty cool. What are some of the reasons businesses are moving towards this headless approach?
Well, performance is a big one. By separating the front end and back end, heavy traffic on the front end won't impact the back end.
Like during a sale, you don't want the website to crash because too many people are trying to buy stuff?
Exactly. Another reason is the demand for customization and personalization.
Yeah, customers today expect a more tailored experience.
And a headless approach makes that much easier.
You can personalize recommendations, target promotions, all that.
Exactly. And it also leads to a leaner technology stack.
Meaning?
You only use the services you need. You don't have all this extra bloat that you're not even using.
Okay, that makes sense.
And finally, this distributed approach can actually lead to faster implementation times.
Really? I would think having all these separate teams working on different things would slow things down.
It might seem that way, but because teams can work independently, they can move much faster and release updates more frequently.
So it's about empowering those teams to be more autonomous.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about the good stuff, but it's important to acknowledge that there are also challenges.
Right, no technology is perfect. What are some of the potential downsides of this approach?
Well, complexity is definitely one. Managing a system with multiple independent services can be more challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It requires different skills, a strong DevOps team.
So it's not just a simple plug-and-play solution.
Not really. You also need to be mindful of increased network traffic. All those services talking to each other can create overhead.
So it's a trade-off, right? You gain flexibility and scalability, but you also have to deal with increased complexity.
Exactly. But for businesses that need to be agile and resilient, the benefits often outweigh the drawbacks.
This has been a really fascinating look at e-commerce microservices architecture. We've covered a lot. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to reflect on what we've learned and consider what all this means for the future of online shopping. So we've talked a lot about the what and the how, but what about the why? Like, why should anyone care about this? What does it all mean for the future of online shopping?
Well, it's not just about websites, right? It's about the whole experience. Microservices give businesses this ability to really keep up with what customers want. Faster loading times, more personalization, seamless transactions across all their devices. It's all about making things better for the shopper.
And a happy customer means a happy business.
Exactly. Think about how you shop online now. You want instant results. You want personalized recommendations. You want to be able to check out in like 2 clicks. Microservices make all that possible.
It's like they're raising the bar for what we expect from online shopping.
Exactly.
And this guide, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. What are some of the things you're seeing on the horizon?
Well, one thing that's really exciting is the use of AI and machine learning. Integrating those into microservices takes personalization to a whole new level.
Oh, wow.
You can use data to predict customer behavior, offer super targeted recommendations, even adjust pricing dynamically.
It's like having a personal AI shopper for everyone.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's the rise of serverless microservices. This is where things get really interesting. It takes that independence to the extreme. You can deploy individual functions without even worrying about servers.
Wow, so businesses can just focus on what they do best. No more messing around with all that infrastructure stuff.
Exactly. It makes scaling easier. It's more cost-effective.
It's all about efficiency.
And ultimately, that translates to a better experience for everyone.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned a ton. Any final thoughts for our listeners out there who are just starting to explore this world?
Just remember, this isn't a trend that's going away. E-commerce microservices architecture is the future. It's already reshaping how we shop online, and the possibilities are pretty much endless.
Exciting times ahead, for sure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.